Hello, hello. My name is Jones, and today we are going to look at the use of cannabis and mental illness. Within this lesson, we try to answer the question, does cannabis cause mental illness? We're going to look at this association because the use of cannabis is being legalized in a lot of countries. Okay, so there is a pressing need to develop a new medication for treatment of psychiatric disorders. There is a growing public interest also in the use of cannabis and its principal constituents, cannabinoids. Okay, so apart from cannabinoids as the principal constituents of cannabis, there is also tetrahydrocannabinol and cannabidiol for a plethora of conditions, including psychiatric disorders. Okay, so tetrahydrocannabinol is abbreviated as THC, and then cannabinoids can be abbreviated as CBD. Okay, so in parallel, there is a considerable also commercial interest that is touting these products, to do with marijuana as treatment for various disorders. As a result, there are health practitioners who need to be well informed about the use of cannabis in treatment of cancer and other conditions in which it has proved to be helpful. Okay, so although there is the potential of therapeutic use of cannabis in all these, that has been covered within the media in treatment of cancer, treating appetite issues, in the treatment of epilepsy, in some section. Okay, so more scientific information is needed so that any decision that we make in trying to have cannabis or marijuana in the treatment of conditions. Okay, so we need to have some meta-analysis on how best cannabis can be used. Is it in its raw form or is it in constituent form? Okay, marijuana tends to be very helpful in its constituent form than in its raw form. But this can just be a statement if we do not have a lot of meta-analysis or we do not have systematic reviews of how marijuana is being used. Okay, although there have been a few reviews that exist, and point out some evidence on that is in published literature, none has considered these available evidence, leading to some controversies on some people being arrested for use of marijuana for medical purposes. Okay, so it's because of the query of safety in using these cannabis compounds, and the mental disorders that may come into play. Now, with laws in many countries allowing the use of marijuana under a variety of circumstances, it is important to understand how it can affect mental health and when its use can become a serious problem. Okay, so within this discussion, we are looking at marijuana necessarily in general and not necessarily within one part of marijuana like cannabinoids or other derivatives of marijuana. Okay, I'm trying to make this emphasis so that we do not end up having an argument that no, marijuana has been used for treatment of cancer and it has been successful, or marijuana has been used in treatment of reducing epileptic seizures, and maybe in some instances that has proven to be true. Marijuana has been used in treatment of anorexia or poor appetite, and in some instances that has been proved to be true. So here we are trying to look at the general use of marijuana and not its derivatives. So cannabis is the most commonly used illicit drug in most countries, with 1 in 3 adults using it at some point in their lives. It's legal in some places around the world, and it is offered medicinally in others. But what does smoking pot or smoking marijuana have to do with mental health? Okay, so the potential harm associated with using cannabis depends on two things above other things that you would want to consider for a different presentation. Okay, so the first is the age at which one first uses cannabis, particularly if it is before 18 years. Using cannabis during key stages of brain development can impact on the synaptic pruning, that is when old neural connections are deleted, and also the development of white matter, which is responsible for transmitting signals within the brain. So we're saying the potential harm that marijuana has, okay, or cannabis has, is the age at which one first begins to use, and if it is before 18 years, it may simply affect brain development, and a person may end up having a mental illness. Then the second part that we need to consider is that the pattern of use that one engages in utilizing this drug, cannabis, okay, the pattern that is to do with the frequency, dose, or duration. Particularly if you are, let's say, using weekly, using daily, the bigger or more potent the dose, then the more tetrahydrocannabinol you are ingesting or you are putting within your system. So you need to know that THC is the main psychoactive component of cannabis, and it appears to act on areas of our brain that is involved in the regulation of our emotional experiences. So we are saying the other thing that we need to consider in the use of cannabis in association with mental illness is the pattern of how one uses this drug. Okay, so the more you use the drug, the more it affects your brain and affects your emotional experiences. So some mental health conditions that may result or may be associated, okay, with marijuana may include depression and anxiety. Then the other one can be schizophrenia. Okay, so when you're talking about depression and anxiety here, many studies of the relationship between cannabis use and mental illness such as depression and anxiety have suffered from methodological issues by not controlling for the related factors. The few longitudinal studies that have been conducted have had mixed findings. Okay, so here I'm just going to talk about some findings. Like a 2014 review of the existing research concluded that using cannabis placed an individual at moderate risk of developing depression. Okay, but within this study, it has to be noted that unfortunately, it was not within the scope of the research to determine if cannabis use was causing depression or if the relationship instead reflects the associated or the association that was between cannabis use and the social problems that that person was having. So cannabis use is associated with other factors that increase risk of depression, such as school dropout and unemployment, because mostly people that tend to use cannabis will drop out from school, or they may get unemployed because of some emotional experiences that they may be facing. So the relationship between cannabis use and anxiety is also complex. Many people use cannabis for its euphoric and relaxing effect. But some people also experience feelings of anxiety or paranoia when intoxicated with marijuana. As such, cannabis could be used to relieve anxiety or stress. That is for the period when the drug is still active. Okay, it will help to reduce some anxiety. Otherwise, within this 2014 review of marijuana. Okay, a variable research within this research concluded that using cannabis placed an individual at a small risk of developing anxiety. But the authors noted that while the weight of evidence supported the coexistence of cannabis use and anxiety, there was relatively little evidence to suggest that cannabis caused anxiety. So within this research, we are seeing that there is some association of cannabis use to anxiety, but there were other questions that were not fully answered. So we are saying use of cannabis may lead to anxiety, and in some instances, it may also relieve some anxiety. So that we understand when necessarily looking at the medicinal use of cannabis. Okay, it has to be noted that not included in these previous reviews of depression and anxiety disorders were two recent investigations of cannabis use within the United States, okay, that were conducted between 2001 to 2005. They included a host of variables such as demographic status and the family environment. So within this, each found a significant association that is between cannabis use and the onset of depression and anxiety disorders. Okay, but this association was no longer significant when considering the impact of the included variables. Clearly, the relationship between cannabis use and depression and anxiety disorder is quite complex and involves the individual's reason for cannabis use and external situations. That is, cannabis may be used to help cope with social problems that were not necessarily caused by cannabis use. Okay, so what is the association of cannabis with mental illness? Here we are saying cannabis may increase the likelihood of one having depression, and cannabis use may also increase the likelihood of a person developing panic disorder or anxiety. In contrast, when we look at schizophrenia, the relationship between cannabis use and the risk of developing symptoms of psychosis has been well established in many different review articles. This presentation has found that early and frequent cannabis use is a component cause of psychosis, which interacts with other risk factors such as family history of psychosis, history of childhood abuse, and also the expression of the COMT and AKT1 genes. Okay, so these interactions make it difficult to determine the exact role of cannabis use in causing psychosis that may not have otherwise occurred. So the presence of these genes may make it difficult, but we are saying there's an association of increased likelihood of one developing schizophrenia after they have been engaged in cannabis use. Regardless, the connection between cannabis use and psychosis is also considered not surprising, because there is a strong resemblance between the acute and the transient effects of cannabis use and symptoms of psychosis, including impaired memory, cognition, and processing of external stimuli. Okay, so this combines to make it hard for a person to learn and remember new things, but can also extend to the experience of deluded thinking and hallucination. We also know that cannabis use by people with established psychotic disorder can exacerbate the symptoms. Overall, the evidence suggests that cannabis use will bring forward diagnosis of psychosis by an average of 2.7 years. Okay, that is average. If one was supposed to develop some mental illness at 18, they then start developing those at 16. One was supposed to develop after genetic predisposition and other predisposition maybe at 30, then they develop at around 28. So we are saying the evidence suggests that cannabis use will bring forward diagnosis of psychosis by an average of 2.7. The risk of developing schizophrenia increases with the duration and the dose of cannabis use that one is ingesting. Okay, so the regular cannabis users have a double risk of that is compared to non-users. And those who have used cannabis at some point in their life may have at least a 40% increased risk as compared to non-user. Okay, so with that said, we're saying it's important to appreciate this risk that cannabis poses to developing schizophrenia. Okay, so now let's attempt to answer the question, when does marijuana use become a problem? Marijuana use becomes a problem when it interferes with the person's ability to function in their personal or professional lives. Okay, so it may become a problem when the use of marijuana in large amounts affects a person, or in small amount affects the person to function normally. It becomes a problem when the use of marijuana, when one wants to stop but fails to stop taking marijuana due to dependence or addiction. Okay, marijuana use becomes a problem when one develops strong craving or urges to use the marijuana or the cannabis. Marijuana use becomes a problem when one spends a great deal of time getting the drug, or using or recovering from using the drug. Okay, where one goes to all extents just to access this cannabis, so it becomes a problem. So the other instances when marijuana use becomes a problem is the continued use despite the cannabis causing relation problems for that individual and other social problems. Marijuana use becomes a problem when it physically endangers that person who is using through dangerous driving, okay, and also it affects the person in participating in constructive activities within society. Okay, so the use of marijuana becomes a problem also when one develops tolerance to the drug, where they will need more and more of the drug. And also marijuana use becomes a problem when one fails to withdraw completely, or may show withdrawal symptoms when they try to stop use of marijuana. Okay, so the question we're trying to ask here is that, the question that we're asking here is, can marijuana cause mental illness? And to answer this question within this presentation, we can say marijuana may increase the risk of developing psychotic disorders like schizophrenia, and can also worsen symptoms in people who already have psychosis. Okay, so that is in answering the question, can marijuana use cause mental illness? Yes, it may increase the risk. So causology and predisposition in medicine is something of great importance. Not necessarily that it is causing, but it increases the risk. Okay, it increases the predisposition for one to develop schizophrenia. Okay, why I'm talking about causology and predisposition is because there are some people out there that may be using marijuana and they have not developed schizophrenia. So there can be family predisposition that is there, and when one uses marijuana, then it increases the risk. Okay, so then can marijuana cause mental illness? Yes, because the marijuana use during adolescence can have lasting effects, including changes to the reward system in the brain and trouble with thinking and remembering. So that will lead to manifestation of mental illness to do with dementia, okay, or memory loss. So marijuana can cause mental illness because of problem of dementia that may come. The other part here to still answer the question, can marijuana cause mental illness? Yes, because marijuana use can cause symptoms of mental health problems like psychosis. Here in psychosis, we are saying they may have hallucination. People who use marijuana tend to have some hallucination, may develop panic attacks, or anxiety. They may develop depression and also may develop sleep disorders. But it is also important to know that these symptoms generally fade after the effect of the drug has worn out. But when you have someone who is an addict, you consistently see these problems of panic attack, hallucination, depression, hence mental illness coming into play. So trying to answer again this question of can cannabis cause mental illness is that people may get too high by using a strain of marijuana that is stronger than they thought it would be. By using too much or by consuming it in different ways, you see that smoking marijuana usually takes effect quickly, that is within a matter of minutes. But if you eat, that is consuming marijuana, may take longer or hours for an individual to feel the effect, and this may make a person end up consuming too much of marijuana because they have not felt it when ingesting it. So to still answer the question, does cannabis cause mental illness? We are saying adults who have been diagnosed with marijuana, adults who have been diagnosed with marijuana or cannabis use disorder, they have high rates of mental health disorders, including anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and attention hyperactivity disorder. It is hard to know whether the marijuana use disorder or the mental health disorder appeared first, since many people use the drug for self-medication. So that is how we can try to answer this question, can cannabis use cause mental illness? So because we don't want to be biased in covering this topic, we can also try to answer the question, can marijuana treat mental illnesses? So for this question, much research supporting the use of marijuana and cannabis as treatment for mental illness is based on some notion that marijuana can be prescribed to relieve certain symptoms. Like if one has post-traumatic stress disorder, marijuana can be used to try to rectify this. Marijuana can stimulate the appetite center. So some people propose that marijuana can be used to treat anorexia, depending on the place and the licensure to use marijuana. For other mental health problems like anxiety, people sometimes may use cannabis to relieve themselves of symptoms of anxiety. Use of marijuana reduces inhibition. So you find that people will use this drug to reduce this anxiety. So how then do you take control of marijuana use? If you use marijuana, here we are trying to advise you on how you can take control of the use of marijuana. So you have to keep track of your use of marijuana and notice your patterns if at all you are developing some addiction or dependence. You have to be specific with yourself about how you would like to change your marijuana use. That is, how often, when, where, and your reasons for making these changes within your life to avoid addiction or dependence. You have to take a month-long break from marijuana, as this will also enable you and your body to get rid of the drug and also reduce the tolerance, so that you can get over the discomfort of withdrawal from the drug. So this can help you to take control of marijuana use. You also need to identify the triggers or the edges, okay, that make you go back to the use of marijuana, or the triggers that have made you to start using marijuana. How you can take control of marijuana use is avoiding marijuana before activities that require thinking and remembering. Okay, so because it will affect your perception and also the flow of activities. Okay, how you can take control of marijuana: don't mix use of marijuana with other drugs or intoxicating drugs like alcohol. Okay, it is important that if at all you use marijuana, you get professional help so that you can be counseled on how you can fight addiction to marijuana, so that you don't end up as a medical emergency in the hospital to try to fight the addiction to marijuana. Okay, so the key points in this discussion is that cannabis use or marijuana use, okay, is prevalent among a lot of people, including those with psychiatric disorders. Its use might lead to the development of mental illness, and cannabis use combined with other drugs or the other drugs that are abused like alcohol and the likes, may be associated with the mental illness. And the diseases that we have talked about is depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, and other diseases that we can see that have mental health in nature is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, okay, dementia, that may also be seen. Okay, so when one is using marijuana, the prognosis in treating them from a psychiatric condition becomes poor and irreversible. Okay, use of marijuana increases the likelihood of one developing schizophrenia. So you have also to be concerned about another component in the use of marijuana, which is suicidal ideation. Okay, so use of marijuana may lead the person with a suicidal ideation to complete the impulse of trying to commit suicide. Okay, so then just having suicidal ideation, it becomes of mental health concern. Okay, so now I've developed a model that will help us to remember some of the diseases, okay, that can be associated with certain conditions that develop and then result into mental illness. Okay, that is, if you talk of epilepsy, there is a mental health aspect. When you talk of HIV and AIDS, there is a mental health aspect. So there are some conditions in psychiatric aspect that lead to these mental illnesses, and these conditions that we see, okay, common, apart from seeing it here in the use of marijuana, okay, within the model I'm calling the DASH model. So the DASH model is just a mnemonic dash, okay, to represent the diseases that can be seen in the psychiatric aspect of a lot of conditions. So in the psychiatric aspect of marijuana, we have seen depression. This depression can also be seen if in the psychiatric aspect of epilepsy. Delusions can be seen, and that is in marijuana use, and also in HIV and also epilepsy when you're discussing the psychiatry aspect of these conditions. So other conditions that we see apart from delusions is dementia, delirium. So D is for depression, delusions, dementia, delirium. Okay, these conditions. Okay, so when I'm talking about depression, I'm referring to bipolar disorders and unipolar disorders that can be seen, as a psychiatric aspect to marijuana use, as a psychiatric aspect to epilepsy, as a psychiatric aspect to HIV. Okay, then the other psychiatric aspects, condition that we see of mental health concern is anorexia, anxiety, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, suicidal ideation, schizophrenia, and we also see some social pathologies that includes stress coping disorder, personality disorders like aggression or melancholy can be seen, and these become of mental health concern. These can be seen in marijuana use, can also be seen in epilepsy, can also be seen in HIV-associated mental health aspects. Then others, of course, that we can include under ACE is stigma and discrimination, substance abuse, that is to do with dependency or addiction, and also sleep disorders. So that is for S in dash, we can see that. Then H is hallucination and hypochondriasis. Okay, that is in the dash. So in the dash we have depression, we have A, anxiety, S, we have schizophrenia, then H, we have hallucination. Of course, I've mentioned the different diseases or conditions that can be seen as a mental health aspect. Okay, so after listening to this presentation, you can look forward and look at the psychiatric aspect of HIV. Okay, you can look at the psychiatric aspect of epilepsy. You can look at psychiatric aspect of alcoholism, psychiatric aspect of substance abuse. You can look at psychiatric aspect of child abuse. You can look at the psychiatric aspect of institutionalization. You can look at the psychiatric aspect of memory disorders. You can look at the psychiatric aspect of sexual disorders, and also look at psychiatric aspect of sleep disorders. Okay, so the list of conditions that we have talked about in the DASH model that we are trying to put forward here, you see that these are some of the conditions that we can see. Of course, per specific condition, there may be specific mental health aspects that you might need to note. Okay, so within this presentation, we were discussing the question, can cannabis cause mental illness? Okay, so in our discussion, we have established that yes, there are some associated mental illnesses that can be caused because of use of marijuana. Okay, so that is depression, anxiety, and schizophrenia as the prominent conditions that we have talked about. But other conditions can still come in to do with hallucination, suicidal ideation, anorexia, and memory losses that we can see. The chief component of marijuana is cannabinoids, tetrahydrocannabinol and cannabidiol. Okay, and we have had this discussion because cannabis is being proposed for treatment of some mental health conditions. It is being proposed for treatment of cancer, okay, and also other diseases like epilepsy. Okay, so it was important that we look at this, and also we look at the mental illnesses that have been associated with the marijuana. So if you have a problem with marijuana addiction, we are saying seek professional help so that you don't end up in medical emergencies. So from me, I'm saying thank you and keep studying.